Because you can be a Nazi from any culture. That's just a political
I don't
predilection.
agree. I think that you've got to be a German.
Oh, I disagree, but okay.
The
Um,
Nazism is the weaponization of German identity.
Meet Sargon of Akkad, the silly office man who harassed some feminists under the name of an ancient Mesopotamian conqueror and ended up getting taken seriously for some reason. Carl, that's his name, loves studies. Or at the very least, he loves studies so long as he thinks they've proven the thing he already believed, even when they don't. His demonstrations of intellectual prowess have inspired such masterpieces as Sargon of Akkad can't read. Sargon of Akkad still can't read. Sargon of Akkad doesn't read his own sources. And let's not forget the time he tried to tell a vegan that plants feel pain because he misread a study on the way plants respond to stimulus from humans. But if there's one study Sargon and in fact the entire who's who of internet white nationalists, I mean not that, are particularly attached to is one on grooming gangs. More specifically, Muslim grooming gangs. So, what are they? Part 1. The history of grooming gangs. The term grooming gang first appeared in the public discourse in 2011, when the Murdoch-owned paper The Times published an article which claimed to be an exposé of a new emerging crime threat. Using evidence of no more than 56 convicted offenders over a period of 14 years, the article concluded with two claims: that men of Pakistani heritage were preying on white British girls, and the authorities were letting them get away with it for fear of being called racist. The article sparked a trend amongst the British press where several other outlets put out similar stories of their own, each plastered with pictures of brown-skinned men and each echoing the same claim that they backed up with a selection of high-profile cases in towns like Rotherham, Rochdale, Derby, Telford, Oxford, Huddersfield and Newcastle. Now, you may have noticed that 56 offenders is a pretty small sample for a country of over 60 million, isn't it? Yes, it is. And I don't expect Sargon to have any love for an article from the Murdoch press that describes 4 offenders per year as an epidemic. If people were going to take this position seriously, they needed something more credible to stand on. In 2017, their puzzle was completed, when the Quilliam Foundation published a study which found that 84% of grooming gang offenders in the UK were South Asian, despite them only making up 7% of the total population. The majority of these offenders were found to be of Pakistani origin with Muslim heritage. On top of that, the report also suggested that the background of these offenders had directly influenced their actions. The aim of the study, in the words of the authors, was to give academic and nuanced context to an issue that many are afraid to talk about for fear of being called racist, and to prevent the hijacking of the issue by actual bigots and xenophobes. Now, if I wanted to be a cheap, make-your-own Baba Ganoush kind of leftist, I would highlight that the Quilliam Foundation have had a sketchy past of baselessly accusing peaceful groups of being aligned with terrorists, or I could talk about how they once had a close relationship with the Islam-obsessed, square-shaped knucklehead himself, Tommy Robinson. But that wouldn't be very convincing for Sargon of Akkad, because if you believe the 84% figure, it's possible that you already have sympathies for someone like Tommy. And even if you don't, his connection to a study is hardly proof that the findings of that study are wrong. In any case, the 84% figure is also present in liberal discourse. It has even been pushed by the Labour MP Sarah Champion, who was once the Shadow Minister for Women Inequalities under Jeremy Corbyn. So if we're going to be fair to these people, we're going to have to read the study, just like Carl definitely has. But before I go into the study, there are a few things I noticed that do set it apart from most research. First, they don't mention how the research was funded. This might not seem like a big deal here, but it's usually expected in case of some simple biases. For example, if there was a study on lung cancer that had been funded by a tobacco company, you'd want to know. Second, there is no sign of any basic quality control that is the standard in academia. For example, when someone like Jordan Peterson carries out research, that work is reviewed by his peers before it's published. Quilliam did no such thing. Thirdly, neither of the authors have any academic or professional credentials that are associated with the work they've done. I suppose this isn't a big deal to Sargon or even the authors for that matter. In the first paragraph of the study, they make no hesitation to call out the politically correct brigade, a perfectly normal term to use in a serious research-based academic report there. I should give some disclosure here. I think this study is incredibly weak and misleading. I would often hear people like Carl bring it up in debates, and people never seem to have much of a response to it, so I got curious and I decided to look at it for myself. Now that I've read it, I'm going to point out some criticisms, and some of the things I think it gets right. Part 2. What is a grooming gang? This might seem like an obvious question, but it's not as clear as you might think, because grooming gang is not a legal category. It doesn't exist on police records, nor does it exist in the courts. The term as we understand it today was born in the media. The closest official term we have is group child sexual exploitation, which is a subset of child sexual exploitation, or CSE. So why didn't they just use the correct terminology? Well, in a way they do, but they do seem to bounce between the two terms in a very confusing way. We do get somewhat of a distinction in their data section, which is mostly made up of them referencing a completely different report by the CEOP. If we look at the CEOP report, we can see that they split child sexual abuse into two categories. Type 1 refers to group sexual abuse where the perpetrators are not exclusively interested in children, but had targeted them because they were vulnerable. Type 2 refers to offenders who network strictly along a shared interest in children. Offenders that fall under Type 2 are often referred to in the press as paedophile rings. According to Quilliam, Type 1 is their rough equivalent of grooming gangs, and the offenders who fell under Type 1 were 75% Asian. Type 2 offenders tend to operate online, and real-world networking between these groups is rare. Quilliam chose not to define Type 2 as grooming gangs because, according to them, no grooming tactics were involved. This seems a bit strange to me because I know that online grooming is recognized by Childline and the NSPCC. The CEOP report that defines Type 2 offenders has 5 paragraphs about how grooming tactics can be involved, so that's a bit odd. You'll also notice that they said real-world networking between these groups is rare. Rare isn't the same as never. Bearing in mind, the Times came up with 4 offenders per year to call grooming an epidemic. As we're about to find out, Quilliam's numbers aren't much higher. If the numbers were already low, why didn't they include Type 2 offenders in their sample? Is it because 100% of Type 2 offenders were white? I mean, definitely not, right? Let's just think for a moment. Did the authors of the Quilliam study find 2 categories of group child sexual abuse, find one which supported their claim, and then just ignore the other? Now, I'm just asking questions here. But in Quilliam's defense, they do mention that the combination of Type 1 and Type 2 offenders still leaves Asian representation at a disproportionate rate of 50%. What they don't mention is that the CEOP clearly states that their data sample is too small to draw conclusions on demographics. But the problem here isn't that they separated Type 1 from Type 2. They were technically allowed to do that because grooming has no legal definition. The problem is that their own definition is vague and constantly shifts throughout the study. In the introduction, they use a description from a government report which doesn't exclude online grooming like they did. They use a description by the Crown Prosecution Service, which turns out to be a court transcript defining one particular case, and then at the end of their introduction, they go back to using group-based CSE again. Why am I bothered by this? Because they're moving the goalposts in a way that makes it very convenient for people to get whatever conclusions they want. For example, when they're using words like epidemic, they will use the broad term, group CSE, and when they're excluding certain groups of offenders, like the ones who are 100% white, they'll narrow it back down to grooming gangs. The most suspicious example of them doing this is where they talk about an especially harrowing case of an online pedophile network, which did use grooming tactics, but which they didn't include in their study because they were focusing on the specific crime of group-based, localized street grooming of young girls for sexual activity. This is the first time in the study we see this definition. It only took them until the 45th fucking page to mention it. So we started with group CSE, and now we finally narrowed it down to localized street grooming of young girls. Not children, you'll notice there. Girls. You can't be a grooming gang if your victims are young boys, apparently. And you know, I'd expect someone with such an anti-feminist background as Carl to be a bit more skeptical about a study that only focuses on the grooming of girls, especially when nearly a third of CSE victims are, after all, boys. But that's the problem with using a term like grooming gang. It was born out of a bad piece of research in a mainstream newspaper. It isn't used in police logs or in the criminal justice procedure. The only time offenders become labeled as a grooming gang is when the story reaches the press, and it's used in the press in such a specific way that white offenders guilty of very similar crimes will find themselves escaping the label. So is that why the term grooming gang never came up during the Epstein scandal? Or with Jimmy Savile and his accomplices? That's a very good question you've just asked. And yes, That's why this Guardian headline on the Rotherham scandal says grooming gang, whereas this one on group abuse in the Catholic Church stays closer to the legal jargon with child sexual abuse. But this wouldn't be very convincing for Sargon of Akkad. Just because grooming gang isn't a legal category, that doesn't mean it shouldn't be. And if Quilliam have given us a clear enough definition, albeit a bit late, then surely they could use existing CSE data and then untangle the grooming gangs from that. The data must have come from somewhere after all. Let's talk about that. Part 3. The data. Quilliam's own research found a total of 58 cases of grooming gangs from 2005 to 2017. The only problem is, they don't say where these numbers came from. Really, they just give you 3 charts with no references. And just to show I'm not being pedantic, let's look at how the CEOP got their data. In their study, they clearly state that they requested information from the police on contact child sexual offending in 2012. They asked 43 police forces in England and Wales for this information, and 31 responded. Quilliam, on the other hand, simply mentions their use of extensive data mining methods. Whatever the fuck that means, I don't know, they don't say. The difference here is the CEOP study can be replicated. You can test their findings. With the Quilliam study, you cannot. This is the peak of pseudoscience. It can't be disproven, but it can't be proven either. With that, though, they give us a grand total of 264 offenders over a period of 12 years. As per the slippery language of the study, they claim that these convictions were for group-based CSE involving grooming tactics. Let's look at that number again. 264 offenders over 12 years. That's 22 per year. Notwithstanding, of course, how horrific these crimes are, the number is fairly small compared to the 6,600 CSE offenders who were convicted from 2015 to 2016. If Quilliam were concerned about the issue being hijacked by bigots and xenophobes, maybe they could have reminded their readers that Asians are actually underrepresented amongst CSE offenders as a whole. 4%, despite making up 7% of the population. That data comes from national statistics in the Ministry of Justice, by the way. You see how I'm telling you where my numbers are coming from there? Not at all like Quilliam did. I am being flippant with them over this point because their clumsy use of language can have a very strong influence on the weak-minded. And I'm not just talking about Carl here. In his video, he cites an article from The Independent which states 19,000 children were groomed in England over 1 year. The subheading explicitly mentions grooming gangs, which prompts Sargon to assume that most of these children were groomed by Muslims. But even The Independent are playing with their terms here. Just in the paragraph below, they drop the word grooming and clarify that these were 19,000 victims of child sexual exploitation. So, not grooming gangs specifically, not even group CSE victims, but CSE victims in general. CSE being the category that isn't overrepresented by Muslim offenders. Let's look again at what Quilliam are using to declare an epidemic then. First, we have CSE offenders as a whole. Around 1 in 10 of these offenders operate in groups, so there we have group CSE. Group CSE is divided into Type 1 and Type 2. Quilliam chose to only look at Type 1. Then, of course, we're only focusing on cases where the victims are girls because, I don't know. Then, as they say, they were looking specifically at localized street grooming, which means they were excluding all the examples of group CSE which involve grooming that happens off the streets, such as in schools, care centres, after-school clubs, sports clubs, the internet, churches, nurseries, orphanages, and of course, at home. So what Quilliam and Sargon are looking at here is a box within a box, within a box, within a box, within a box. Part 4. The whiteness of the victims. If the way they counted the data on the offenders was bad, the way they did it with the victims was even worse. The other central claim by Quilliam is that most of the victims were white. And how did they find this out? They didn't give any numbers because it's not really normal for a court to log the ethnicity of a child abuse victim. Instead, they used testimony evidence from the offenders. Well, one offender. They used a quote from one of the offenders. That's 0.4% of their total sample, talking about one of his victims who was white. Most of what I've spoken about until now could be excused as clumsy research, but what they've done here is very suspicious. The study constantly references a piece of work co-written by Dr. Ella Cockbain, an associate professor of security and crime science at the University College of London. I know her name is actually pronounced Cobain, but I'm sorry, we're not doing that here. When this study was published, Cockbain was a little annoyed at Quilliam for saying, all the victims who have come forward so far and revealed their identity have been white. Why? Now, one of Quilliam's 10 case studies came from Derby. According to Cockbain, her own research found that 8 of the victims in this case were black or ethnic minority. When Cockbain and others highlighted this issue, amongst many others, Majid Nawaz, the founding chairman of Quilliam, responded by calling them good, posh, white socialist active demics, disgusting #regressive left neocolonial hypocrites, and vicious white #regressive left socialists. So really watering the flowers of much needed dialogue that is nuanced and evidence-based there, am I right? Did I also mention that neither of the Quilliam authors had any relevant qualifications or credentials for the work that they did? Well, in keeping with good honest hatred of identity politics, Telegraph columnist Alison Pearson reminded us that the Quilliam authors were both of Pakistani heritage, so it's pretty hard to accuse them of demonizing Muslims. Sold. And I should take this moment to thank the Telegraph for single-handedly collapsing the idea that Jeremy Corbyn, a British man, could ever be accused of hating Britain. Isn't it strange how so many mainstream media outlets are backing this narrative which is supposedly a taboo? Part 5. The Anti-Islam Industry. It's safe to say that Quilliam's sample of offenders was extremely small and their sample of the victims was even smaller, but this didn't stop them from forming a very broad cultural explanation around the religion of Islam itself. Grooming, they say, is caused by divisive, unevolved cultural identities, unchecked cultural misogyny, homophobia, insufficient integration of migrants, child marriage, and so on. The problem with this explanation is that there is nothing in here that would stop Muslims from being overrepresented in all CSE cases. But they're not. In the UK, up to 90% of convicted paedophiles are white, and white people make up 86% of the total population. The overrepresented demographic for CSE here is not Muslims, it's men. But Quilliam persists with this explanation even when they talk about how groomers would coerce their victims into sexual activity by bribing them with drugs and alcohol. You know, just like the Quran says you should do.
And the thing is, there are doctrines in Islam that would permit this.
Okay, I'm sure there are, but given the size of Quilliam's sample, it's hardly an interpretation of Islam that many of them seem to follow. In any case, Carl knows better than to put blame on a community of millions for the actions of a small few.
Yeah, it seems that they've learned nothing. It seems that everyone's too afraid to tackle this, because it would mean actually addressing the Muslim community as a community. The Muslim community.
Never mind. The thing is, there isn't actually anything controversial about studying specific crime types and ethnicity. What's controversial is the bad research with bad conclusions and the insane demagogues who use it to draw even worse conclusions. You'll notice that the CEOP were studying ethnicity, and they didn't have to call anyone a regressive neo-colonial soy cuck. If anything, the opposite is true. Quilliam have taken over $1 million in funding from a Christian evangelical millionaire. Tommy Robinson used to parrot the grooming gang narrative under the employ of the Canadian billionaire-funded outlet Rebel Media. The term grooming gang itself was born in one of Britain's widest circulating newspapers, owned by one of the most powerful, albeit craziest men in the fucking world. The truth is, when these people are complaining about their repressed free speech, billions of dollars are pumped into platforming these ideas to an international audience where they're given the license to say all the things they're not supposed to say. Anti-Muslim rhetoric is a thriving global industry. These people are not upset because they don't have a platform. They're upset because they don't have access to every platform all the time. Sure, they don't have much of a platform in academia, but that might be because whenever people in the academic community do try to engage with their work, they get met with this bullshit. But enough of this. Let's talk about something that Quilliam got right. Part 6. The Absence of Justice. Throughout the Quilliam study, we are reminded of how long it took some of these cases to come to light. Terrifying stories of gross negligence and victim blaming are woven throughout, and it looks like the police were mostly let off the hook. But why? Well, Quilliam have put it down to an attitude of extreme political correctness of those in positions of authority who brushed this data under the rug for several years. I'm not going to argue too much with the evidence on this one because they haven't really given any. Neither is Sargon. You know, I always wonder about this idea that there's a culture of political correctness in the police. Because if we're talking about the UK, where black people are 28 times more likely to be stopped and searched, or where a disproportionate number of black people have died after the use of unnecessary force by officers, I'm sorry if I'm struggling to imagine a culture of neo-colonial socialist soy shakes making its way into the police force. It's true enough though, every study I've read on grooming gangs admits that there's an issue of underconviction. I did spend a long time discussing Quilliam's first claim, so you'll have to forgive me if I challenge this one with a more simple answer. All sexual abuse is under-convicted. When it comes to the abuse of children, studies suggest as little as 3 to 15% of abuse ever gets reported. Quilliam does at least use a bit more grace than Carl in saying that in their own study, other potential victims, for example those of Asian ethnicity, may hesitate to recount similar experiences due to taboos around sex, family honor, and cultural shame, and their stories may therefore never come to light. But it doesn't take much to see how shame can affect all victims. Barely a decade ago, victims were routinely dismissed with seriously stigmatizing and victim-blaming labels such as streetwise or consenting child prostitutes. Hardly the kind of terms you'd find in a culture of extreme political correctness. Today, the greater willingness to report amongst victims has been largely owed to authorities replacing the term child prostitution with sexual exploitation of children. But despite advances, the impact of austerity over the last decade has meant chronic underfunding not only of police forces but also on counselling and support services for sexual offence victims. This is especially true of working class communities like Rotherham, and it's something our current government has shown little interest in addressing. Our own Prime Minister once described investigations into non-recent child sexual abuse as spaffing money up the wall. For those listening who are not members of the British upper class, the word spaffing is posh boy slang for ejaculating. Not the most delicate term given the subject in question. But surely the attention given to grooming gangs has helped to raise awareness too. I remember there was no shortage of EDL activists and Sargonoids screaming the words "I told you so" when the Rotherham story came out. Because of course there was definitely nothing else happening around that time that could have encouraged sexual abuse victims to come forward. Let's talk about that. Part 7. Who contributes what? In 2017, survivors of the Rotherham gang published an open letter calling for the ban of EDL marches in their community, where they detailed the anxieties and the trauma caused by those marches, as well as their frustration with their abuse being exploited to fuel hatred and fear. Of course, this isn't the sentiment of all the victims, but helping the victims of sexual offences should be a fairly uncontroversial move. There's a reason you don't see a split of opinion amongst victims when it comes to organisations like Childline or the NSPCC, for example. At least nothing compared to Soigonov's Blackad's old party, who found themselves in trouble in 2019 when they launched an anti-grooming helpline. The helpline didn't last very long after it received complaints for having no data protection statement and no information about the call handler's qualifications or suitability for the task, which is a little fucking terrifying actually. But to let Sargon off the hook here, this probably had nothing to do with him. I suppose the buck here would have to stop with their special personal advisor on rape gangs. Interesting. This isn't even to mention the abuse felt by Muslims in Rotherham, who have been made to feel guilt by association even after the local groomers have been sent to jail. Muslim boys report being bullied as groomers, and an alarmingly high number of Muslim assault victims are called groomers by their attackers. In 2016, a local elderly man named Mushin Ahmed was beaten to death outside of his home in Rotherham by his two neighbours, whilst they shouted the words "Paddy" and "Groomer." And guilt by association does not stop with the UK. In Norway, Anders Breivik posted endless diatribes online about Muslim groomers and the rape of European women before he murdered 77 people, one of whom was only 14 years old. The Christchurch shooter, all the way over in New Zealand, had the words "For Rotherham" inscribed into his ammunition as he gunned down over 50 Muslims in a mosque as they were praying. Of course, these are nothing more than unique rogue actors whose actions have nothing to do with the kind of things Carl says.
The Muslim community.
Sadly, this bias extends far beyond mass shooters. Shortly after the Rotherham scandal, an independent report of the South Yorkshire Police's responses to CSE found that they were underperforming when it came to uncovering offences because their definition of CSE was too narrow, and they were all too often looking for signs of exploitation in the wrong places, i.e., amongst Pakistani men. The National Crime Agency has complained about inconsistencies in reports that confuse the very specific grooming and pimping model with CSE as a whole. Notice this is exactly what Quilliam did. So it isn't just the media or the internet shitlords making this mistake. The problem with people myopically focusing on such a particular crime is that it risks allowing crimes that don't fit the grooming gang shoe to escape under the radar. Group CSE prosecutions involving white offenders are given far less media attention, compared to what they reserve for Asian gangs. The true epidemic here, of course, is CSE in general. And if you think I'm deflecting here, maybe I can help by offering some other solutions to CSE, the rhetoric of which has a refreshing record of zero connection to mass murderers. Firstly, the removal of terms like child prostitute saw an immediate rise in victims seeking help, and the offer of community-based support and safe spaces allow them to make first contact in an environment without the same stress factor as a police station. If you support a Tory government that has been cutting and closing these services for the last 10 years, please, please, please don't do that again. The removal of stigma and blame from victims is essential here and is something that feminists have been fighting for over a century. I'm sorry, Carl, they just have. Other government departments and non-profit organisations that focus on violence against women and girls have been instrumental in providing support and raising awareness amongst communities to help them identify and deal with abuse in a way that considers the incredibly delicate position of the victim. Contrast this with the behaviour of Tommy Robinson, who illegally live-streamed himself confronting defendants as they walked into a court building during the trial of the Huddersfield Grooming gang. When the video went viral, one of the defendants exploited this event and argued that it could have influenced the jury, and the trial came close to collapsing. Tommy claimed he was charged with causing distress for paedophiles. What he didn't seem aware of was that the commotion and delays caused by his behaviour added additional stress to the victims, who were already having to go through the difficult and traumatic experience of recalling and testifying. But we all know the real solution these people want to see. I mean, technically, we won't have any Muslim grooming gangs in the UK if we just didn't have any Muslims living here, right? I suppose so, but by the same token, could we also eradicate paedophile rings if we just stopped white people from giving birth? In fact, if we stopped the births of white men, almost all forms of sexual assault would disappear, and you know what, let's not do this. Because it turns out, I don't need to ask Sargon what he thinks of sexual assault when it's being done by white people. Back in the dark years of 2016, when people were arguing about whether there was such a thing as rape culture in Western societies, Smarmy Gon of Baghdad's response was essentially, yes, but only because of all the Muslims. When it came to rape in general, he had this to say.
You are suggesting something that has been common to humanity since the dawn of humanity, and in almost every other animal species, is not something inevitable that we just have to live with. You will never put an end to rape. It will never, ever happen.
Part 8. Sargon's Hypocrisy.
Imagine the following scenario. You go out with some friends for drinks and have an excessively good time. A few too many Jaeger bombs later, a friend takes you to his place so you can crash at his and you pass out on his couch. In the morning, you wake up with a foul taste in your mouth and also realize that you have dried semen on your lips and face. When you tell this to your friend, he informs you that after you passed out last night, he put his penis in your mouth and used it to get off. Clearly, this is rape, right? You were orally penetrated while unconscious and unable to give consent. You've just been the victim of a crime, right? Well, not in Oklahoma.
For anyone familiar with Sargon's work, you might have noticed an inconsistency between his clownish and dismissive attitudes towards rape that suddenly turns into outright fury as soon as it's being done by brown people. Bearing in mind this is the same Sargon who once said this of a British female MP.
There's been an awful lot of talk about whether I would or would not even rape Jess Phillips. I've been in a lot of trouble for my hardline stance of not even raping her. I suppose with enough pressure I might cave. But let's be honest, nobody's got that much beer.
Or to bring it closer to home, we also have this timeless take on age of consent.
I think it depends on the child, really, doesn't it?
Wait, that sounds really bad. Maybe I should give it some context.
I was well under the age of 11 when I started having sex, and so what I like to do is put people on the other side of the argument. It's like, what you have to do is you have to say that someone like me, not anybody else, but me, that I was too stupid to appreciate the nature and quality of what I was doing at the time. So please convince me I didn't know what I was doing.
Yeah, I think it depends on the child, really, doesn't it? Because some kids.
That's what the Catholics say.
Well, it's true, and it's true though. It should really be a case by case basis. But I can see why the whole thing. But it's not really something I'd ever put too much thought into, to be honest.
At first glance, this looks like a glaring hypocrisy, but I want to argue here that this pattern of thinking is much more consistent than people might think. To Sargon, graphic descriptions of archaic oral penetration laws in Oklahoma can be laughed off. But a crime type consisting of 22 offenders per year counts as an epidemic that isn't being spoken about enough. Is this clash not all a little familiar? Say when Trump complains about Mexican rapists, but then has at least twice been caught on camera telling underage girls that he plans to date them in the future? Because that would literally meet the definition of grooming. And just to keep things balanced here, let's not forget his opponent, the broken pull-string doll himself, sloppy Joe Biden, who frequently parroted the 1 in 5 stat while his own behaviour around women and children is a cause for concern to say the least. In the 90s, Hillary Clinton famously spoke about the threat of super predators, a bogus criminal profile which was exclusively reserved for black men. Of course, this is the same Hillary Clinton who shamelessly slandered other women for accusing her adulterous husband of sexual misconduct. As it turns out, the Rotherham victims were probably right to doubt the sincerity of EDL activists, given how their outspokenness on sexual assault always seems to stop when the same offences are being committed by one of their own. But again, these positions are consistent, because these people are all following a very simple rule of discourse here. That is, sexual assault is not a big deal, unless it's being done by foreigners. You can see this attitude littered across incel forums, where people coyly favour the idea of sex with children and are then disgusted when black and brown people are seen doing the same thing. It's the same reason a Greek Golden Dawn MP who had assaulted 2 of his female opponents stood on an anti-immigration platform which claimed to defend Greek women from the sexual aggression of foreign males. Probably the most striking example I could find of this mindset was on a forum, which had numerous posts decrying the existence of grooming gangs in the UK. This forum was none other than that of the rape legalization advocate himself, Roosh V. Carl's ramblings may seem confused at times, but his positions are not inconsistent. They are a constellation of madness that marks the essence of white nationalist ideology, the intersection of misogyny and xenophobia. A fool? He may be. But an honest fool he remains. His gaff-laced shitshow of a career has been a display of the perfect marriage between the possessive nature of anti-feminism and the hateful nature of anti-Muslim bigotry. But I think that's me done with Sargon for a very good while. I just have a few words for the people who made it this far. Holy shit, thank you so much for watching. And especially if you're a Sargon fan who made it this far, hello. I really hope there was something in there for you too, and I know this topic can be very disturbing, and writing it definitely was. And for all the YouTube shit-slinging that goes on, the people who really matter in all this are the victims. For that reason, I will not be putting up any Patreon or PayPal links in the description here. Instead, I thought any money that does come from this video should really be going to somewhere that is helpful for CSE victims. I've linked a couple of groups in the description that you could donate to if you'd like. The first one is the NSPCC, who have been leaders in child protection all the way back to 1884, and sadly they have also had to struggle with austerity for the last 10 years. The second one is called Unseen, who specialise in curbing modern child slavery, a phenomenon which is still very much alive and well in Britain. I'd also recommend you look up Ella Cobain. She's kind of a leading figure in this area, and she's done an insane amount of work around tackling these kind of crimes. I wouldn't have been able to make this video without her research, so definitely give her a look if you want to know more. I also just like it that one of Carl's favourite studies was completely outdone by a feminist called Cockbane. There's just something special about that, isn't there?